Thank you for tuning in to an episode of InRange. I'm coming to you today from Bisbee, Arizona, the queen of the copper camps. This was founded by a man named George Warren when he found an incredible copper deposit here and has been active in mining from way back in the 1800s all the way up into the 1970s, going from adits and shafts and underground mining to open pit mines, which are incredible to see today. But I'm not here to talk about mining, and I'm not here to talk about George Warren. I'm here to talk about that street behind me, which is the main street of Bisbee, and the 4th of July parade that was going to happen here on July 4th, 1919. On July 3rd, 1919, soldiers from the 10th Cavalry from Fort Huachuca, about 35 miles away from here, came here that night for a little rest and relaxation because they were going to be in the annual 4th of July parade on that street right behind me, and this is their story. So where I'm standing right now is the lower part of Brewery Gulch in Bisbee, Arizona. In the Old West and in the New West, including up until today, this is really the entertainment district of Bisbee. But back in the Old West and New West, this was one of the most renowned red light districts. Saloons lined this entire street, this entire canyon, from the lower to the upper. There was saloons, entertainment, billiards, pool, gaming, brothels, mostly on the upper part of the actual canyon. And if you were a soldier stationed on the frontier, a place as remote as Fort Huachuca, this would probably be the first place you'd go to spend some of that money burning a hole in your pocket. And that was no different for the men of the 10th Cavalry. However, they were buffalo soldiers, black men of the American military, in a segregationist world, in a segregationist environment, in a city that didn't deal with them or treat them properly. That means that the lower part of the lower Brewery Gulch was not available to them. They would have walked up this street to Upper Brewery Gulch, where there were a couple establishments that were willing or participatory in serving their kind. One of those was the Silverleaf Club, which is where we're headed right now. I'm standing right now in the city park. In 1919, when the events of what we're discussing in this video occurred, this would have been the city park. But it was only in 1916 that they had actually finished reinterring the bodies from what this was originally, which was the Bisbee Cemetery. Someone around 1892 realized, hey, you know, that cemetery up Brewery Gulch, it's right in path of our water supply. And that made people a little alarmed, and they formed the new cemetery in 1892 and started deinterring the bodies from here in 1914, finished it around 1916, and turned this into the city park. This is going to be one of the first videos about the Red Summer of 1919, hopefully many, because there's many topics to be dealt with in this regard. The Red Summer of 1919 is one of those historical topics in which we see historical amnesia, induced intentional amnesia. We don't want to remember these events. And this story we're telling today is related to the Red Summer of 1919. When the American Expeditionary Forces, under the command of General Jack Pershing, sent the Buffalo soldiers, colored soldiers, to the front of World War I, they didn't want to deal with racial segregation or any of the issues that came with it. And Pershing put the black soldiers under the command of French officers. This, of course, is a communication issue, etc. But what's interesting about this is that the French officers started treating these black soldiers like regular soldiers. They didn't treat them as anything subjugated or lower. They were just soldiers to help them in the cause against the Central Powers. Pershing felt it to be a problem and issued a letter to the French command saying, pretty much, don't treat these people as your equal. French officers were very embarrassed by this letter, that their allies would write something like this, and most of these letters were actually burned in disgust. So not all copies of this letter were destroyed, even though the French were trying to save embarrassment for their American friends. And W.E.B. Du Bois actually published a copy of it in the NAACP newsletter Crisis. This meant that all Buffalo soldiers knew that they were living in a very segregationist, racist environment. And the reality is that the country demanded their loyalty, but no loyalty was given back to them. These men coming back from the front, late 1918, early 1919, demanded at least a modicum of respect for being soldiers in the American Army and the military. And the reality is this country didn't want to give it. What they were met with was white racists, white supremacists, and the Klan, essentially a lynching and movement across the entire country, of which this episode in Bisbee is one of the smallest versions thereof. So the industrial workers of the world, sometimes referred to as the Wobblies, really a worldwide unionization movement, went on strike in 1917 for very simple reasons, which turned into what is now known as the Bisbee deportation. Topic for another video, way too deep for today. However, Sheriff Wheeler, who was the sheriff of Cochise County at that time, also covered here on InRange on a video called When the Old West Became the New West, formed a posse and arrested over 2,000 of these men, put them on train cars and deported them to the middle of the New Mexico desert to ostensibly die. We're not aware of any of them dying in the New Mexico desert, but what they were now were persona non grata. They lost their careers and even maybe their families in the process of being deported to the New Mexico desert. And as a result of that, in the interest of community defense, they had people giving them information from around the community to let them know what they needed to be aware of for their own safety. As a result, they had a lot of information about what the local law enforcement was potentially planning for the Black Buffalo Soldiers of the 10th Cavalry, and they came to them with some very important information. So this building would have been across the street from the Silverleaf Club. It looks like by the architecture that it would have been around here in 1919. But across the street, I'm actually standing in the ruins of what would have been the Silverleaf Club at 94 Brewery Avenue. At about 9:30 p.m., an altercation occurred between 5 of the Buffalo Soldiers and 1 white military police officer. We don't know who started it. We don't really know the specifics around that, but we do know that an altercation occurred. The white military police officer was disarmed and struck over the head. This narrative got back to the chief of police, Kempton, and he issued an order to his officers, go up the gulch and disarm all Negroes that you can find. One of the officers with him was a man named Hardwick, who we're going to get into more. They started coming up from the lower gulch to the upper gulch, disarming every black person they could find by whatever means possible, striking them over the head, arresting them, whatever they thought they should do to quote-unquote disarm all the Negroes. As from what we said earlier, the Wobblies told them something might be going down in this town that's going to be pretty dangerous. Make sure you're aware and you're careful. That version of aware and careful for the soldiers of the 10th Cavalry was to remain armed. So at 10 p.m. here on July 3rd, 1919, this street turned into a dramatic firefight. Approximately 100 shots were fired from the officers' posse and the black soldiers of the 10th Cavalry. Miraculously, no one was killed. However, an innocent Mexican woman was struck in the head. She survived. At midnight, the black soldiers realized they could not sustain this fight reliably, and they ultimately surrendered and were disarmed. At this point, a small number of them were sent under an officer's watch, disarmed back to the military encampment in Warren, approximately 3 miles south of here, but the other 50 black soldiers were now disarmed and under arrest. At one point, an argument erupted between some of the soldiers of the 10th Cavalry and Officer Hardwick, and without even a flinch, he drew his revolver and shot one of them in the chest to put them in their place. Miraculously, he survived as well, but I have to wonder if the soldiers of the 10th Cavalry thought to themselves, maybe we shouldn't have let ourselves get disarmed. This reason that this didn't turn out as badly as it could have is very counterintuitive. In March of 1919, President Woodrow Wilson in a conversation stated, and I'm paraphrasing here, that the Negroes coming back from abroad would convey Bolshevism to America. As a result, he was concerned in a proto-Red Scare type of situation, and he sent the Bureau of Investigations to investigate the actions of the international workers of the world, who were seen as this communist subterfuge plot across America. As a result, the Bureau of Investigations was deeply trying to figure out what was going on with the Wobblies here in Bisbee, very specifically after the deportation of 1917. What they turned up wasn't some communist plot. What they did turn up was that the police here and the authorities of Bisbee were actually plotting to put the Negro in their place and were aware of that situation. As a result, they informed the officers of Fort Huachuca and others, and this firefight that happened here meant there was no disciplinary action happened or came to the 10th Cavalry Buffalo Soldiers. So as I said, miraculously no one died. Poor innocent Mexican woman was shot in the head. She survived, but we don't know in what condition. We know that none of the soldiers of the 10th Cavalry died, and we know that none of the officers died. We also know that no repercussions came for this event, even though the actual federal government and the Bureau of Investigations actually found local law enforcement culpable, not the soldiers of the 10th Cavalry. But that's how things worked in 1919. Maybe still to this day. But that said, we still need to talk about Officer Hardwick. He continued his law enforcement career here in Bisbee until his actions became a little too intense for this community, and he was pushed off to Tombstone. Even Tombstone didn't really want him, and eventually he turned in his badge there and landed up in Pinal County, where he ran there for a while. Pinal County got tired of him, and he landed up in Calexico, California, where he became referred to as the Czar of Calexico, where he ran like a warlord-like approach to law enforcement in Southern California. If you're interested in this topic, which you should be, because it definitely is induced amnesia and something we leave out of the American historical narrative, I urge you to look into it. The Red Summer of 1919 is very interesting from the perspective of what it meant then and what it means now. Just like these ruins behind me, it still reverberates till today. People, if you like this kind of content, it's not going to be coming to you via any kind of ad support, because ads won't advertise on content like this. We also have no sponsors and no masters because they don't want to do this kind of content either. The reason this kind of content can exist for you is because of supporters via Patreon and Utreon that are allowing this channel to survive via their financial support. This is completely a viewer-supported project and allows me to do this kind of history that's otherwise intentionally ignored for viewers like you. Thank you for watching, and share with your friends.